Hi everybody and welcome to this revision video which goes through General Adaptation Syndrome or GAS and how that can lead to burnout. So this is part of the psychological health and well-being topic as part of stage 2 psychology. Let's get started. So in my previous video I went through how sometimes stress can be a good thing depending on what type of stress it is. So if it's eustress, that can be a good thing. Obviously de-stress is a bad thing, and that can lead to acute stress and chronic stress, which obviously has long-term health implications. So that's what this video really focuses on. So too much negative stress in everyday life can have serious effects on our health. So long-term health effects of de-stress and chronic stress include an increased risk of anxiety and depression, digestive problems such as irritable bowel syndrome, headaches, chronic pain, heart attack, high blood pressure and stroke, sleep problems, particularly insomnia, weight gain and memory problems. So long-term chronic stress is not obviously ideal because it leads to long-term health effects, which can obviously lead to these very nasty issues and promote an earlier death, which obviously we want to avoid. So it's important that we recognize when chronic stress is affecting us and what actually goes on biologically, psychologically, and socially. So in 1976, a researcher called Selye developed the term General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS for short, to describe how the body deals with stress over a long extended period of time. So General Adaptation Syndrome is often what occurs, in other words, to put it simply, when chronic stress has been going on for a very long period of time, so months or even years. So let's look at this in more detail. So there are three main sections to GAS, or three main phases, in other words, of GAS. So the first phase is the alarm phase, all right? So this is when there is a release of adrenaline and the flight or fight response is activated, as I talked about in my previous video. The body will release cortisol and epinephrine. So these are our main stress hormones. Now, these are the hormones that give us that yucky, negative feeling. So it's not positive eustress, like that excitement, kind of euphoric feeling when we're feeling really stressed, but in a good way. Cortisol and epinephrine are those nasty sort of, not nice feelings of stress that make us feel overwhelmed and make us feel negative emotions. So when we go through the alarm phase of General Adaptation Syndrome, basically our flight or fight response is activated and our body will release cortisol and epinephrine, which is a type of adrenaline. These are our stress hormones. Now, usually what should happen, as I've talked about previously, is once the stressor has passed, our parasympathetic nervous system will kick in and we will return back to normal, all right? That is the case for de-stress and acute stress if it's only short term, all right, which is fine. However, someone who's going through chronic stress, so long-term stressors, will then enter the second phase of General Adaptation Syndrome, which is resistance. So this is the parasympathetic nervous system trying to do its job, so it tries to conserve the body's energy. However, the physiological responses remain slightly elevated. So in other words, we remain slightly stressed for a very, very long period of time above resting levels in the normal range, or, resting levels in normality. So as we can see here, all right, the bodily signs characteristic of the alarm reaction have virtually disappeared. Resistance rises above the normal range if this stage is prolonged. All right, obviously long-term effects can occur and that leads to exhaustion. So when I say long-term, I mean months or years of chronic stress or slightly elevated levels of stress for a long period of time. This unfortunately is quite common in our modern society, especially with certain types of jobs, which I will talk about later in this video. So the last phase of General Adaptation Syndrome is exhaustion. So after a significant amount of time, the body can no longer sustain that heightened level of arousal or stress, in other words, and the body's ability to repair tissue and fight off diseases is reduced. So it decimates the immune system. So eventually the body will just say, nope, can't do this anymore, and makes us far more prone to illness and developing those really nasty illnesses that I talked about before. So heart attack, stroke, if I just go back, depression, anxiety, digestive problems, weight gain, etc. All right, so stress is one of the biggest killers. unfortunately, that lead to these really, really nasty and serious illnesses if it's not obviously managed and maintained. And if we get to general adaptation syndrome level, eventually the body will become exhausted and the immune system will be unable to fight off illness, and it will, damage the immune system indefinitely. So this is obviously worst case scenario of long-term stress, and it takes several months or more typically years for this to develop. The good news is that there are several strategies to reduce stress, which I'll talk about in a separate video. So this is something obviously that we want to avoid. So general adaptation syndrome. So this may lead to or be more common in certain industries and certain jobs. So most jobs and occupations from time to time can be demanding. But there are jobs that are more demanding than others. So jobs containing various unpleasant elements, so constant exposure to loud noises or constant harassment, threats of physical violence, perpetual frustration, or varying shift workers are more demanding, therefore more stressful. So this can lead to what's called burnout, which is a separate concept to general adaptation syndrome, but they are very closely related, as we can see here. So it is linked to the exhaustion phase of general adaptation syndrome. Sometimes burnout won't get to that point, but they are very closely linked. So it can lead to burnout, a general sense of physical and emotional exhaustion in relation to one's job. So it can be linked to the exhaustion phase of GAS, general adaptation syndrome. So again, there's a lot of awareness campaigns around mental health, which I've talked about already in a previous video. And the push is obviously for reducing the stigma and making people aware of certain industries, especially in the last few years, given what's been going on with the pandemic and so on. So the emergency services definitely are a higher risk of job burnout. So this is from your workbooks. Let's have a look at some other industries where job burnout is more common, all right, and what sort of stressors are typical. So police officers, so stressors specific to the occupation, making it more likely for job burnout and exhaustion phase of general adaptation syndrome. So police officers, obviously, increased risk of physical dangers, excessive paperwork, a lot of red tape, dealing with court systems, co-worker and supervisor conflicts, and a lack of support from the public, because often police officers are seen in a very negative way when they shouldn't be. Firefighters, okay, so uncertainty over whether a serious fire or hazard awaits after an alarm, okay, and obviously certain jobs that they go on may be life-threatening to them as well, and some of the things that they would come across and would see would be quite horrific. Social workers, so little positive feedback from jobs or from the public. It can be unsafe in certain instances. So frustration in dealing with bureaucracy, excessive paperwork again, sense of personal responsibility for clients, and work overload. I probably should say at this point, these are based on feedback from people in the industry. It's not going to be the case that every single police officer or firefighter and so on experiences all of these. But this is based on the feedback and the research that has been done by Salsky and Smith in 2005 and the typical stressors that these industries go through. So this is not to put you off getting into these industries by any means, but this is just what's been commonly reported and making people more aware of, the demands of these industries and to show kindness and compassion, and where possible, bring in legislation to protect their physical and mental well-being, which has happened since this research was done, which is good. Okay, teacher, can relate. Excessive paperwork, lack of adequate resources or facilities in some instances, a lot of work overload, a lack of positive feedback in many cases, in some instances poor student behaviour, and a threat of physical violence. Nurses, so again, work overload, especially in the last couple of years, heavy physical work, so lifting patients and assisting patients, obviously, to get around. Patient concerns, so dealing with death and medical concerns of patients, interpersonal problems with other medical staff, especially physicians, so, workplace conflict. Emergency medical workers, so unpredictable and extreme nature of the job and sometimes inexperience of certain job or certain situations. Air traffic controllers, they are consistently ranked as one of the most, if not the most stressful job in the world that leads to very quick job burnout. So little control over potential crisis situations, obviously in the air, and high workload, fear of causing an accident, peak traffic situations, and general work environment. There's actually an interesting video that's linked into your workbooks that goes into the stressors of an air traffic controller. Clerical and secretarial work, so little control over job mobility, unsupportive supervisors in some instances, work overload, lack of perceived control, and managerial work. So work overload, conflict and ambiguity in defining the managerial role, and difficult working relationships. So again, this is not to put you off getting into these industries if that's what you're thinking of doing after school. But if stress is not handled and support is not given within the work environment, it can lead to burnout. So the good news is that there are several ways and certain strategies that people can employ to reduce the risk of leading to exhaustion phase of general adaptation syndrome and, of course, by extension, job burnout. So I hope you found this video useful and interesting. As always, if you've got any questions, let me know.